in American Jewish Studies and was also a finalist for the Samuel Roth Prize for Jewish Literature. Shari received her PhD from Yale and is coming to us today for Rabin. So Shari, thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you, Laura, and to Kirsten, and to everybody who made my visit possible. It's been really lovely to be here, and I'm excited to talk to you all about this project. So the book began really with the discovery of a primary source. I was stumbling through the online catalog of the library and looking for sources, and I stumbled upon a very slim volume called Isaac Mayer Wise's Western Journey. And it was a compilation of letters that Rabbi Isaac Mayer Wise, who's an important Jewish leader associated with the Reform movement in the 19th century. They're letters that he wrote on a trip he took to San Francisco in 1877 on the Transcontinental Railroad. And he wrote to his newspaper, The Israelite, describing his journeys, describing what he saw along the way. So just a little snippet of Isaac Mayer Wise, sort of soaring 19th century language. I have heard the same somber melodies of the Pacific coast and the eastern base of the Rocky Mountains, as we have them in Cincinnati and the Atlantic coast, from New Orleans to Milwaukee. I found the same devotion, the same people, the same faith everywhere. It's wonderful how Judaism has established itself everywhere in a few short years. It is the hand of God. It is a new revelation of grace. So this really lofty, soaring language from Isaac Mayer Wise on the one hand, but then elsewhere in these letters, you hear him describing sort of the Jews that he meets in his travels and his grave disappointments in them. My favorite is he talks to young men in Nevada City, sort of in a mining community, and they tell him, as for Judaism, they keep that down in San Francisco, right? Like, Judaism's for the city people, like, we're not interested in that. So he's, on the one hand, sort of amazed at this westward expansion that he's seeing, and on the other hand, he's gravely disappointed in sort of what Judaism looks like on the ground. So I was just really struck by this set of letters because there was nothing that I had really read in American Jewish history that helped me make sense of them. Isaac Mayer Wise is very famous as a capital R Reform Judaism proponent. That's sort of how people know him. But this was a very different Isaac Mayer Wise, more sort of colorful and sort of candid. And I wanted to understand sort of how to make sense of him, but also the ordinary Jews that he met on the road. And if you know anything about American Jewish history, the vast majority of it is focused on the urban experience, is focused on the period after 1880, right? The image that we have is of the Lower East Side tenements, right? Yiddish-speaking, socialist, Jewish immigrants. And that literature did not really allow me to make sense of this. So I thought, maybe if I look at this story, we'll gain something new. And it's, the 19th century is a very rich and important period in American history, in modern Jewish history, and I found that looking at this material really added a lot. It not only added sort of a more interesting and more complete sort of take on American Jewish history, but it also, to me, helped explain a lot about American Judaism and what it looks like. So, of course, Jews have lived in what is now the United States for a very long time. The first American Jewish community, people date to 1654 in Amsterdam. And there were Jews all over the eastern seaboard in major cities through the colonial period and into the 19th century. But some dramatic changes start happening in the 19th century. The changes begin with the founding documents of the United States. The Constitution, the Bill of Rights, etc. These documents are actually totally uninterested in Jews as such, right? The founding documents never say the word Jew. And that actually was really important for how Jewish life developed, because essentially, sort of de facto, without anyone making too much of a fuss about it, Jews were understood to be white citizens, which was very different from the situation in Europe, and which allowed them the ability to move unimpeded throughout the United States, and allowed them to create their own forms of religious life, right? If they wanted to create religious community, they had to organize and fund it on their own, which was very different from other places. And these changes were accelerated by sort of westward expansion, I found. So there's a number of changes between roughly 1776, 1820 that are going to set up quite dramatic changes in American Jewry. Because into this sort of changing United States comes a mass migration of Jews, the first mass migration of Jews in American history. So you can see here, this shows kind of all the dates, so it can be hard sometimes, I'll need just to stand up. The period I'm interested in is through 1820, where we've got around 3,000 Jews. 1880, right, which is where most histories sort of assume that American Jewish history really gets interesting, it's 300,000. So, right, that's like 100-fold increase in the American Jewish community in 60 years. Usually people, forget about it because of what happens by 1920, which is over 3 million Jews. So that is, a huge number, and there's dramatic changes associated with those migrations. But still, this 1820 to 1880 migration is really transformative for American Judaism and what it ends up looking like. So who were these Jews who came in the 19th century? Most of them were from German-speaking lands. They came for reasons that immigrants always come searching for economic opportunity, but they also were struggling under various legal disabilities in German-speaking lands. There was this ongoing struggle in the 19th century for Jewish emancipation, essentially whether Jews could or should become citizens of the European places that they lived in was a really open question. And there was lots of sort of 2 steps forward, 3 steps back, and in these various places. So there was lots of restrictions on what Jews could and could not do. And this is a favorite example of mine. So here you see, when I say German-speaking lands, it's because Germany as a unified country doesn't exist until 1871. So these Jews are coming from all of these different kingdoms and city-states and sort of polities. And for instance, Bavaria, 1813, it's right there kind of at the bottom in the green. It's about the size of South Carolina. Amongst their laws was a rule that settlement in excess in communities where Jews already live, or settlement in areas where there are as yet no Jews, can be permitted only by the highest authority. So if there's too many Jews in a place, you can't move there. If there's no Jews in a place, you can't move there. So if you want to move, you can only go to a place that has like a medium number of Jews, is essentially what this law is saying. And each one of these little polities had their own kind of rules and regulations on where Jews could live, what kind of jobs they could have. There was a lot of restrictions on sort of Jewish activity. And this was also true in further east in the Russian Empire, where famously Jews are restricted in where they can live to an area known as the Pale of Settlement. So throughout Central and Eastern Europe, there's a lot of restrictions on Jewish activity, and so that's motivating this migration in many ways. And in fact, many of the migrants come from Bavaria, because Bavaria had especially sort of strict regulations. The state regulation of sort of Jewish movement and Jewish occupations was not the only way that the European states were interested in Jews, though. The sort of flip side of it was that the state funded Jewish institutions. So taxes from Jews would fund an official community known as a Gemeinde. So these institutions just kind of were there in each locality and would provide Jews kind of the stuff of Jewish life. And the rabbi, for instance, was a state-appointed official. So there was kind of governmental supply, but also oversight on religious life. So given that context, arriving in the United States in the 1820s, 1830s, 1840s is very exciting, right? Previously, you're limited even within an area the size of South Carolina, for instance, and now there's this massive expanding continent that you can move throughout in pursuit of economic opportunity. So large numbers of migrants come, many of them young men, and they no longer sort of stick to the coast. They go westward. Many of them were peddlers who would sell goods door to door in places where there weren't stores, right? So they are kind of purposely going to places in the hinterland. And they chose peddling because this was a profession that Jews in Europe had a lot of experience with, and it proved very well suited to this new environment. It was pretty easy to sort of find a relative or another Jewish person that you know to sort of help you get that first set of goods, and then you just go out and start selling. It's sort of an easy way into the American economy. So already by the 1820s, Jewish peddlers and others are moving west to places like Cincinnati and St. Louis. According to one estimate, before the Civil War, Jews could be found in at least 1,000 different towns and cities throughout the United States. So they're really dispersed and spread out. So what's Jewish life like in these random places that they're going? You know, a Macon, Georgia, a Keokuk, Iowa, what have you? Well, there's not a ton to speak of, right? There's all of this amazing economic possibility, and yet they're mostly in these far-flung places surrounded by Christians, and it could be hard to find the sort of fundamental materials of Jewish life. And so on the road and in the absence of an infrastructure, these Jews often departed from the strictest standards of Jewish life. And many historians have looked at American Jews in this period and have basically sort of diagnosed them as apathetic or as assimilating. Right? They say, you know, they weren't members of synagogues, they didn't observe Jewish law very strictly, so they must have been assimilating. A big part of my project, though, is in fact arguing that they were adapting Judaism to new conditions, and that the sort of flexible forms of Jewish life that they created are characteristic of the American Jewish experience more broadly. So I brought another source. I love primary sources, so it's a little bit long, but I think it's very colorful, and it's about, I picked a source about Michigan, so I will read it out loud, and then I'll sort of dig into it. Okay. On our way from Sandusky, we passed through Toledo, Ohio, and Adrian and Monroe, Michigan. We could not learn anything of Monroe, though no doubt there are Jews there also. So they are in almost every town to the west of Pennsylvania. The situation of Monroe seems to us to be both beautiful and well-suited for many kinds of business, and will no doubt attract settlers before long who may desire to escape from the crowded cities where the greatest efforts can scarcely procure more than the barest living. As our readers know, Detroit is one of the towns which evidently must attract to it a large commerce from its very favorable position. The Israelites are already numerous there and appear to be doing well. We could only spend one day, the 14th of July, among them. We were kindly received by the Reverend Lippman Adler, who officiates as Chazan Shofet teacher in Moyle, thus having ample engagements to fill up all his time. We visited the synagogue with him. It is situated on a favorable position, only a little too high for comfort, although when you are once in it, you will find everything very well and properly arranged. So I picked this because I like to bring a local source when I'm visiting a place. Also, I had a family in Monroe, Michigan. My great Aunt Becky and great Uncle Ted, R.I.P. They were like pillars of the Monroe, Michigan Jewish community. So I wanted to sort of shout out Aunt Becky and Uncle Ted while I'm in Michigan. But it's also, you know, a really interesting source that gets at a lot of the themes of sort of American Jewish life in this period. Jews were living in many far-flung places, usually in places like Monroe or Adrian or Toledo, places that might not have Jewish communities organized yet. And for the most part, they were doing well, right? The author here makes sure to note the Israelites are doing well in Detroit, right? So people are sort of comfortable within their communities. And so in a place like Detroit, they had a community there because they went about setting one up. Usually in these places, it would start with purchasing a burial ground to bury the Jewish dead. Then they might create a mutual aid society or a benevolent society. In various places, there were Jewish fraternal lodges. So they start building up these institutions sort of slowly but surely in various places. Sometimes they also would live together. This is from the U.S. Census of 1860 in Macon, Georgia. And I love it because along the left side you can see the census taker wrote boarding house. And one of these men, David Steinheimer, who's listed number 10, he has a memoir which is held at the Jewish Archives in Atlanta. So I know David Steinheimer there later goes on to be one of the founders of the Jewish community in Atlanta, and here he is as a young man in 1860. He's, 20 years old, and he's living with his brother and with a bunch of other young men, all most of them from places in the German-speaking lands. And several among them were members of the Macon congregation, which was founded in 1859, but not all of them. So you can see that Jews are sort of coming together, even if whether there's a congregation or not, people are coming together and creating forms of Jewish communal life in an institution like a boarding house, as well as in an institution like a congregation. And in these boarding houses, they would pay rent by the week and get a room and a daily meal sort of communally. And boarding houses were kind of infamous for having terrible, suspicious food. So I think for Jews, especially who might be concerned about kosher food laws, living with fellow Jews provided some amount of security that they wouldn't have gotten otherwise. As Jewish settlements increased in number, they did eventually create congregations that could facilitate worship and ritual practice, as well as just social life and other forms of communal life. So here we see the creation of congregations, which happens very dramatically. Right in 1840, there's less than 20, and by 1877, there's more than 250. So there's really a lot of institutional growth. The first Jewish congregation west of the Alleghenies is in Cincinnati in 1824, and there's this dramatic increase. This is despite the fact that these congregations faced many challenges, including the very real threat that the members would all leave town. In fact, that happened in Sandusky, Ohio. They founded a congregation, and then a year later they said they reported that everybody had up and moved further west, and so now the congregation was no more. Eventually, another congregation was started, but it's this situation of mobility and young men, many of them single, looking for the best economic opportunity, and so there's no guarantee that these institutions are going to sort of be lasting. There's also lots of struggles within congregations in this period. There's concerns over religious reforms, over the minhag or custom. What's congregational life going to look like? How are we going to worship? Because it's these Jews coming from many far-flung places. And there was lots of tensions with the religious leaders, right? In the source from Detroit, it talked about how the religious leader was the kosher meat slaughterer, he was the ritual circumciser, he led the services, he taught the children, right? So in many of these communities, they would just try to hire someone to do all of the stuff of Jewish life. Most of these men were not ordained, they were just guys who knew how to do a lot of Jewish stuff. And the congregations would hire them, and oftentimes tensions would emerge. Right, there's actually from Macon, there's letters from one Jewish religious functionary there complaining that they have to wait an hour before they can get 10 men to the minyan, right? So these Jews we're putting in all this time to create congregations, and hired these functionaries, but then they're not always showing up when they're supposed to. They're not always appreciating what the religious leaders are doing, and they're not always following Jewish law very closely, which drives the religious leaders a little bit crazy. I brought another source. This one's from La Pointe, Michigan, where 10 Israelites met for public worship in La Pointe, Michigan on the Rosh Hashanah holidays in 1854. And they, describing Native Americans in ways we might not today, but essentially they're involved in trade with Native Americans, and they had gathered in that community and found one another in order to devote the sacred period to rest and worship. So again, even Jews who are not in places where there's a stable set congregation, they're finding one another and they're creating forms of Jewish life in a number of ways. And there's a lot of really fascinating episodes from this period of Jews kind of violating Jewish law in some ways in order to facilitate Jewish practice in other ways. So there's a number of places I found where Jews in this period start counting women in a prayer quorum, which was not at all traditional. It actually only became a part of progressive Jewish denominations in the 1960s. But if you're in, Lafayette, Indiana in 1860, and there's a lot of Sunday closing laws in places at this time, so many Jewish men have to work on Saturday, and they realized essentially if they waited for 10 men to show up for prayer services, it was never going to happen. So sort of pragmatically, they end up accepting women as part of their prayer quorum. There's also examples of Jews sort of doing what we would call today kosher-style eating, not keeping kosher but refusing to eat pork. There's examples of Jews going to church but then critiquing the sermons that they heard there. There's examples of Jews who never joined a congregation but then wanted a Jewish burial when they died. and also intermarried Jews, and there was quite a bit of marriage between Jewish men and Christian women in this period. And then there's a lot of examples of those men still trying to remain within Jewish communal life in various ways. So there's one example I love from Minneapolis, St. Paul, where the congregation has a Jewish man married to a Christian woman who wants to be a part of the congregation, and they don't know what to do. So they write off letters, and they send one to Rabbi Isaac Meirweiss in Cincinnati, who's more sort of a reformer, more progressive and modern, and they send one letter to Rabbi Morris Raphael in New York, who's more traditional. And essentially, the letters come back, and it's totally diametrically opposed answers, right? Isaac Meirweiss says, yeah, like, let that guy into your congregation. Nothing in Jewish law says you can't. And Morris Raphael says, like, absolutely not. That man has cut himself off from the Jewish community. So they kind of were left, where they began, and like in many of these places, had to figure out, okay, we're just a bunch of random peddlers in this far-flung place without much guidance. What do we want to do? What do we want our Jewish community to look like? And the minutes weren't clear on what happened, but I assume that they had accepted the member into the congregation, if for no other reason, that they needed the membership dues and they needed the body for the prayer quorum. Those pragmatic concerns were very real to these people. And I think it's important to keep in mind that this was really the first time when they were in charge of their own Jewish religious life, right? There wasn't a state-appointed rabbi sort of overseeing things. They had to sort of decide to take money out of their pocket and create this institution, and that made them feel like they had skin in the game in a way they hadn't before, and they had to sort of figure things out on their own. So the other thing that's interesting to me about these sources that I've been sharing with you is not only that they describe this sort of eclectic forms of Jewish life emerging in far-flung places, but also that it appeared in a Jewish newspaper. And Jewish newspapers are really, really important in this period. The Occident, an American Jewish Advocate, is actually the first lasting American Jewish periodical. It's founded in 1843 in Philadelphia by Isaac Weiser, who wrote those reports that I read before. And these newspapers were really, really important in American Jewish life. Right, there's all these random congregations kind of establishing themselves all throughout the country, but there's no denomination, there's no sort of unifying institution, there's just these random congregations, and then there's Jewish newspapers that people start subscribing to that create connections between them. So the newspapers were really the only national Jewish institution in the United States. And there were also Jews for whom a subscription to a newspaper was their only form of Jewish affiliation. Amongst the most popular sections was the domestic news sections, which is where those reports that I showed you came from, where local Jews would kind of write into the editor of the newspaper in order to put themselves kind of on the map of American Jewish life. There were also some Jews who would travel to various places and write into the newspaper about their travels. And then the editors themselves would go off and visit subscribers and communities and make connections that way, and then write about them for the newspaper. So there are all these reports, and this was one of the sources that people, when I started this project, people had mentioned them here and there in local Jewish histories, but no one had ever really considered them as kind of an important genre in and of themselves. And yet there were some months or in weeks where the editors of the newspaper would say, like, we're sorry that we can't publish more of the local news reports. We can't publish more of your letters. We ran out of room. So these Jews were really eager to sort of put themselves on the map and sort of say, we are here. And I think, on one level, these reports were practical. They helped Jews know where they could find one another for business, worship, or other connections. And I think sometimes they described how well everybody was doing economically in these reports in order to try to recruit more Jews to come their way. But they also helped Jews kind of figure out what Jewish communal life would and should look like in different parts of the country. Oftentimes, communities, when they first created an institution, would write in describing it. And then sometimes the editor would give their commentary on what was happening. So you get different layers of sort of what does it look like to create a Jewish community? How are people going about this? And of course, it helped American Jews feel like they were part of a larger community together. One Jew in Dakota Territory in 1869 wrote, quote, "In my solitude, the Jewish papers, I read all of them, keep me in connection with the Hebrew community. I read and imagine to be a member of society. There's a famous 20th century theorist named Benedict Anderson who argued that newspapers and books, but especially newspapers, help create imagined communities and help create nations. But here we have an ordinary Jew in 1869 sort of scooping Benedict Anderson, saying, these newspapers help me feel like I'm part of a community of people I don't know, but who I know are out there and part of a shared collectivity with me. Another one of the important newspapers was the Israelite out of Cincinnati, which was Isaac Mayer Wise's newspaper, founded in 1854. And I love this sort of, you can see here the sort of let there be light. There's a sort of visual culture of these newspapers that I think is really beautiful as well. You can see here he writes, it's a weekly periodical devoted to the religion, history, and literature of the Israelites. So these newspapers connected Jewish communities and individual Jews who subscribed to them. They also made their editors into very important leaders and kind of celebrities in the American Jewish community. Isaac Leeser, Isaac Mayer Wise are the two kind of editors that were most important and whose newspapers were most widely read. So Isaac Leeser arrives from Westphalia in 1824 and starts off in Richmond, Virginia before moving to Philadelphia. Isaac Mayer Wise arrives in 1846 from Bohemia. He's a little bit younger than Isaac Leeser. And he first starts off in Albany, where he has like a tumultuous tenure at a congregation before moving to Cincinnati. And then building up Cincinnati is a very important sort of Jewish center in this period. He describes Cincinnati as a Jewish metropolis, which you would not call it today, but in the 19th century, that fit. So these two leaders become very important. Because of their responsibilities as editors, they have contacts all over the country. These Jews in these far-flung places are writing letters to them, asking for help, asking for advice, describing what Jewish life looks like in the places where they live. And they both also travel very extensively and visit these communities. Wise had gone to St. Louis in the 1850s and visited lots of towns along the way. He describes Keokuk, Iowa at one point during that trip as like a very fertile place for Jewish growth. Like, there will be a great Jewish community here soon, which also ended up being correct. But in the 19th century, you never knew which city was going to be Chicago and which was going to be Keokuk, right? Everybody's sort of trying to find where's going to be the best opportunity. And Jews are in all these places, and these editors go and visit them. So they're very in tune with what's going on in the American Jewish life, kind of on the ground. And they also sort of have opinions about what American Jewish life should look for. They comment on many of the reports that they publish. They argue for and against various developments in Jewish life. And they offer opinions on, for instance, if a religious functionary arrives in the country and is looking for a job, they might give an endorsement, right? And at a time when there's no rabbinical institutions, there's no sort of credential for Jewish religious leaders, these editors kind of fill in that role and say, this is a safe person to hire for your congregation. So they really were deeply enmeshed in American Jewish life. And they understood fundamentally that it was developing very unevenly throughout the United States. They knew that Jews were sort of eclectic in their religious practices and pragmatic. They knew that many Jews were marrying non-Jews. They sort of knew everything that was going on, and they were concerned about it. Now, Wise and Leeser did have disagreements, as I mentioned, and oftentimes they're presented as capital R Reform in Wise's case and capital O Orthodox in Isaac Leeser's case, but I think that's overly simplistic. Though they had their differences, they agreed upon what was the problem with American Jewish life. They agreed with the challenges that were most pressing and that most clearly needed to be addressed. They both were concerned by this uneven development of Jewish life, a few Jews in this place, a few Jews in that place, developing Judaism in very different ways. And they wanted to sort of standardize American Judaism, to make it orderly and stable. Right at one point, Isaac Mayer Wise wonders, if each congregation and each Jew is left to their own devices, are they even going to recognize each other as Jews in 20 years' time, right? If each is doing their own thing, it's going to be chaos. So the chaos of American Jewish life is deeply concerning to both of these individuals. They both argue that one way to solve this is to create a uniform style of liturgy, or a minhag, for all American Jews. Isaac Mayer Wise is kind of famous for coming up with the Minhag America, the Rite of America, a new form of practice that will supersede previous geographic differences of Sephardi and Ashkenazi. Isaac Leeser, actually, it's lesser known, but he advocates for American Jews just all adopting the Sephardi minhag, the Sephardi practice, even though most Jews are not themselves in the United States Sephardi. So they both try to sort of make a unified form of Jewish worship, so at least if a Jew goes from town to town, they can, worship with one another. They both also want to create national institutions that can unify American Jews and also sort of make available the Jewish resources that are missing in many of these communities. And they succeed to some extent. Isaac Leeser in 1859 founds the Board of Delegates of American Israelites. The title is actually sort of mimicking the British sort of overseeing organization for Jews. And he describes it at its founding as a measure calculated to introduce more intimate relations between these scattered communities. So these scattered communities to him are really important. He wants to create an institution that can unify them all. The Board of Delegates, 1859 is a tough time to be founded in American history because, 2 years later a Civil War breaks out and you can't really get a lot done. Unifying business is not, not going well at that point. So the Board of Delegates, is never a hugely important institution. It never gets sort of the majority of American Jews under its auspices, but it's an important start. And in 1873, Isaac Mayer Wise and his allies also start an institution, this one called the Union of American Hebrew Congregations. And likewise, Wise describes it as being founded out of concern for our brethren in the country far away from Hebrew congregations, a few in this and a few in another town. So in both cases, they're obsessed with this problem of these far-flung Jews, idiosyncratic ways in which they're developing their Jewish practices and their forms of Jewish worship. They both feel like this is the problem and we need to solve it. Each hoped that all Jews would join their institution, but they also perpetually tried to understand and serve those who didn't. So even though they tried to get congregations to join, they also were concerned with sort of American Jews outside of congregations, right? Wise says it explicitly. So they started doing projects like gathering statistical information to figure out sort of where are Jews located. They started obsessively trying to collect data, sort of early forms of the National Jewish Population Survey happening in the 1850s, trying to see kind of where are Jews, how many of us are there, where can they be found. They also try to set up a system of circuit preaching. They look around and see like their Methodist neighbors have preachers going from town to town to sort of spread religious ideas, and there are all these far-flung communities which might not have a congregation or might not have a religious leader, so they say, hey, why don't we start sending rabbis to go preach to these communities? Unfortunately, because these congregations are sort of each on their own, they have a hard time coordinating that. Basically, no one wants to pay out of pocket for that, and there's no sort of large institution, or what institutions there are not powerful enough to sort of make that happen. So there's sort of, they have these great ideas, but it's a challenge in the end to reach all these Jews that they're interested in. They also finally worked to set up a system of rabbinic credentials, which ultimately ends in the creation of Hebrew Union College, the first American Jewish seminary for rabbis, which was founded in 1875. And people talk about that seminary as being created to help create an American rabbinate, right? It's to create rabbis who can speak English, who are sort of culturally in tune with American ways. But also on a more fundamental level, they created it just so that they could have rabbis who had some kind of credential that could be verified so you would know who you were hiring. There was a lot of concern in this period by congregations that they were going to hire someone, and what if they turned out to be a drunkard? Or what if they lied about their credentials, right? There's a lot of uncertainty just, how are we going to know that the person we've hired is legit? And Hebrew Union College is one way to deal with that problem. The By the way, the religious functionaries themselves complained on the other side. They complained that they were being sort of exploited in their workplaces, that the congregations weren't supporting them, and they had a point too. So there's a lot of ways in which the institutions are trying to sort of ease some of these tensions that are created by sort of the mobility and the sort of instability of American life in this period. So what's interesting in part about these institutions that Leeser and Wise create is that in some ways, as I mentioned, they already were doing this work in their newspapers. Right? They already were sort of vetting potential religious leaders. They were already gathering reports from different communities to understand where Jews were demographically. They were already sort of traveling themselves to different communities and preaching. And yet they still believed that a sort of formal, national, unified institution was necessary. So in their efforts to create an American Judaism, they were trying to create a Judaism that was unified and standard throughout the nation. More so, again, than anything ideological or cultural. Someone like Isaac Mayer Wise, yes, he's interested in religious reform, but he sees it mostly as a way to achieve this goal of unification and standardization. Right, that is what they're concerned about. And Isaac Leeser says, yes, I want people to speak English, but it's not necessarily that they're trying to sort of prove that they're American. It's because practically there's Jews coming from all over the world and moving around this massive continent, and just logistically it makes sense to have a unified language to help create this unified American Judaism that they're envisioning. Leeser, in fact, at one point describes his goal as combining American Judaism into a homogeneous mass. So, which to him is really appealing, right? Which to us, a homogeneous mass does not sound good, right? We celebrate diversity, but for Isaac Leeser, diversity in American Judaism is bad. He wants it to be standardized and uniform so that wherever you go, you'll experience the same kind of Judaism. And you can see this kind of hope in the kind of language that we saw with Isaac Mayer Wise in the beginning, that I began with. And you see it here again in a quote from Isaac Leeser himself. Leeser and Wise failed in their most ambitious efforts, but they helped create the foundations of American Judaism. So here in 1845, we have Leeser saying, "This will indeed become a country where the Jew will have his home, where he may travel through its length and its breadth, and find brothers with whom he can worship, of whose food he may partake, and with whom he has the same hopes, with whom he has the one God and Father." So you see this sort of poetic imagination of a continent made sort of home for Judaism, because it's a place where Jews can go and live their lives as Jews. And so again, even though the institutions that they tried to create, the attempt to create a homogeneous Judaism in America failed, this was overly optimistic. Still, Leeser and Wise and these far-flung Jews did help kind of create American Judaism as we know it, right? And the other thing about this source is that Leeser, right? The Leeser wants unity. Whether these ordinary Jews always want to find their fellow brethren, whether they want to share food or want to share beliefs, is another question. But whether they all agreed, they did create this impressive infrastructure of American Jewish life, with congregations, markets, newspapers, societies, and ordinary Jews sort of used these as they would and made them their own as they themselves adapted to American life. So this story of American Judaism in the 19th century, I think, is more complete. It offers a fuller picture of what was happening by looking at different kinds of Jewish experiences and sources than we might normally look at. But I think it also helps us understand kind of American Jewish history writ large more clearly. It shows that mobility and religious creativity, pragmatism and eclecticism, all of which are sort of fueled by mobility, right? So the mobility and creativity, they've been the rule of American Jewish life, not the exception, right? So when people today are fret that Jews aren't joining congregations, or they're not keeping kosher, they're not observing the Sabbath, they're not the first in American Jewish history. This has been an ongoing sort of theme of American Jewish history. And the anxious religious leaders fretting about them is also part of American Jewish history. So American Jewish history is essentially this back and forth between ordinary Jews trying to figure out how can I best live out a Jewish life in the context that I find myself, and then religious leaders trying desperately to sort of rein them back into what they see as a proper vision of American Jewish life. Thank you. answer any questions. Okay, right there. Yes.
Did your sources say anything about how discrimination and everything affected people in various parts of the country and that time period?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And there were ways in which, amongst the challenges to creating Jewish life in America in this period was that America was, in many ways, a Christian nation, right? There was a lot of Protestantism around them. They were surrounded by pious evangelical Christians in many cases. And they also were living in places where the laws were sort of created by Christians and designed to sort of create a pious Christian moral order. The most important example is the Sunday closing laws, right? This is a period in which people work 6 days a week, and if there are laws forbidding you from working on a Sunday, and you're a sort of, a ne'er-do-well Jewish peddler, you're not going to observe the Jewish Sabbath. Right, so the Sunday closing laws are one place where we see sort of tensions and exclusions. Usually it was not sort of self-consciously anti-Jewish, but there were places where Jews, complained and said this is violating our religious freedom, that to be, forced to work on our own Sabbath. And when Jews complained, sometimes there would be pushback. So there's an example in the 1850s from California where the Secretary of State of California says, it's an added bonus of this Sunday closing law that it might discourage Jews from coming to the state. So there are those kinds of ugly sentiments that can be found. There's also sort of famously during the Civil War, which is a time of intensified sort of pressure and anxiety. There's the famous example of Ulysses S. Grant, then a general. He comes out with an order number 11, which basically bans Jews from the department under his oversight because he associates them with sort of nefarious economic activity. He basically says, Jews are speculators, and speculators are a problem for my military, so let's kick Jews out. That is very short-lived. It's kind of universally decried, and Jews pretty quickly get to Abraham Lincoln, who says, no, we're not doing that. So it's a moment of sort of Jewish distinctiveness, right, because Jews were overrepresented in peddling, becoming a problem. So there are these moments where Jews are just different enough from the majority population in just the right way, and it becomes, visible to the broader population, in which there are moments of discrimination, exclusion, negative sentiments. But in fact, for the most part, sort of ordinary Jews in 19th century America, they might experience curiosity, but there were so few Jews in America at this point that people didn't even know that they were looking at Jews. And oftentimes there was even the opposite. There was excitement, there's a Jew in town, I'm gonna travel to see a son of Israel, right? So the opposite is true as well. And I think really what I see happening in this period is that it's less of a problem for Jews to sort of become American. The bigger problem is that it's easy to become American and it's hard to stay Jewish. That's the real struggle that they find, even with those kind of moments of tension around Jewish identity. Yeah.
I get the feeling that American Jewish life beyond the pale of the coast in the 19th century was not very different from the 20th century. My eldest uncle was a physician who was mustered out of the army in New Orleans after the Second World War. He discovered on Christmas Day that it was war, and he decided to stay in Louisiana. So he looked around for a town to work in, and he ended up interviewing and successfully in this little town, which then and now still only had a couple of thousand people. And when he interviewed...
What's the town called?
The town is called Amite, Louisiana. It's in Tangipahoa Parish. The mayor, the fire chief, and a lawyer were the interview committee. He sits down and interviews with them. And if you know something about Louisiana politics, it's religiously oriented. There's a Baptist north and a Catholic south, and most of the towns are organized around these two religions. So this town of one street, 2 blocks, and a Baptist church on one end and a Catholic church on the other. The interviewee, he gets to the point where they ask him, which church is he going to join if he becomes doctor of town? And he said, I'm a Jew, I didn't really plan on joining either one of them. And there was some silence for a while, and then the mayor said, we don't really care about that, we just want to know if you're a Baptist Jew or a Catholic Jew.
Yeah, so, not really a high level of knowledge about Jews. Right, and and I think it's easy if you're focusing on your studies on New York to forget that, max Jews have been like maybe 1 or 2% of the American population, right? So, yeah, certainly could not expect a great amount of knowledge of Jews. And in places where there were Jews, oftentimes they were seen as kind of another church in the community, and you would see Christians, donating money to the creation of a synagogue and vice versa, pulpit swaps between Christian ministers and Jewish rabbis and functionaries. So there is, in some of these small places, more of a sort of coexistence than you might think otherwise.
I was kind of curious, in many of your examples, people refer to themselves in one of the newspapers called Israelites.
Yeah.
What do you think during this time caused that term to be more prevalent, and what caused it to be phased out? I mean, I know this is not my period or anything like that. I would have some hypotheses, but I'd be curious to see what you said about it. And also in terms of the westward expansion, it seems like many of your examples would be what we would think of as the Midwest now, and I'm wondering whether basically it was the same if you looked at, and you had an example of California, or I don't know, what we think now is more westward, whether there was kind of it was basically more dispersed, but a lot of those same things, trends that you talked about were going on, or you still see more differences between examples of Detroit and Cincinnati versus, Colorado or California or something like that?
Yeah, great question. So, yeah, Israelite is a little bit of a mystery. My sense is that they like the associations with the Bible. They're trying to sort of, in some ways, present themselves as Americans who practice Judaism, and the Israelites are biblical characters. Their association with the Hebrew Bible, which is positive. I also, because I'm interested in their mobility, I like to think that maybe the wandering of the Israelites appealed to them as a way of sort of thinking about their experience. But yeah, I'm not 100% sure, and I would be curious to see a study of tracking exactly which terms are used when. But they'd also describe themselves as Hebrews, as Jews. When they're writing for a Jewish audience, they call themselves Yehudim sometimes. So they use a variety of terms. And then also to kind of describe who they are, they sometimes describe themselves as being of the Jewish persuasion. They'll talk about Jews as a class. They'll talk about the Jewish race. They use all sorts of language to try to sort of fit themselves into American ways of understanding, right? Like what's going to be the most sort of well-received way of describing who we are to people. So that's my guesstimate as to why Israelite is the most popular. So I totally have lots of examples from California and throughout the South. I brought the local examples because I think it's always fun. But yeah, you would see similar things in those places. Slightly different migration patterns. In California, there are a lot of Jews in little gold rush towns, like in Grass Valley, California. There's a source that I love where they write in to describe that they've gathered for the high holiday services. They say there's 12 Jews. I think they say there's 20 Jews in town, 11 of which got gathered together in the high holidays, and the rest of them mocked us. So they know who all the Jews in town are. And then there's tension, but even in a place that small, there's Jews who who are known as Jews, but who want to reject any kind of organized Jewish life. And in those places, right, to make Jewish life happen in Grass Valley, California in 1857, you have to, have a volunteer try to get, try to lead the service, and you have to kind of do your best and cobble it together, and they do in many of these places in similar ways. So there's differences in kind of the social conditions and sort of what the sort of economic life looks like. But I have not noticed tremendous differences in this pattern of sort of Jewish institutional development. Yes.
Did you find anything in your sources when Jews are living west or in the Midwest and then further, where they would be coming up against Mormons, another religious minority, where the stakes of being Israelites or claiming Israelites is deeply embedded in their self-identity. And I'm not aware of anything, but as you were talking, I was wondering about that, particularly because we've got Mormons in Michigan at this time period, and so wondering.
Yeah.
Using the term Israelite too.
Yeah, so there's some interesting like intersections. There are Jews who go to Salt Lake City in the 19th century. I've seen some sources, and actually Utah's first non-Mormon governor is a Jew in the early 20th century. So there's, they're accepted by that period enough to have a Jewish mayor, a Jewish governor. The first Jewish governor though is Idaho, which is slightly before Utah. Right, and that is part of the story too, is that it's Jews sort of entering into political life. So there are Jews who live in those communities, and it's similar kind of patterns, and they do write about sort of interactions with members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. There's also a couple of these travel writings. I think Isaac Meyerowitz in his travelogue, in his stops in Salt Lake City. There's a famous travelogue from the 1850s by a man named Solomon Nunez Carballo, who was a Charleston Sephardic Jew, and he's a daguerreotypist, which is an early form of photography. And he joins an expedition westward in search of a path for the Transcontinental Railroad with John C. Fremont, who later will run for president. So he goes with John C. Fremont westward, and kind of later writes a memoir as part of the campaign to elect Fremont. So he writes this sort of a memoir in support of his presidential aspirations, and he describes their travels. And they go westward, and they basically end up in like a really rough way, like they're out of food and the horses are dying, and then they sort of come out the other end and like barely survive, and they're in Utah. And he describes spending time out there after in Salt Lake City and hanging out with Brigham Young, and I found a couple examples of Jews hanging out with Brigham Young. And my sense is that anyone who went to Salt Lake City in the 19th century like hung out with Brigham Young. Like everybody claims like, oh, he was like extra nice to me. So Carballo similarly sort of has his Brigham Young moment, and kind of describes in relatively sympathetic language kind of what's going on in Utah. So you do see a sort of interest in that. And Carballo actually then goes on to this is in 1854, and he goes on to Los Angeles and helps found the first Jewish institution in LA, which is a Hebrew Benevolent Society, before then kind of making his way back. He's in New Orleans for a little bit, and then he ends his life in New York. And there's actually a recent documentary about him called Carballo's Journey, which is interesting, which David has seen also.
Yeah. I enjoyed it very much. Yeah, I did.
Yeah.
So you spoke a lot about the mercantile class and the peddler population as being the majority.
Could you talk a little louder for the people back here?
Sorry, you mentioned talking about the mercantile class and the kind of peddler community moving in sort of frontier lands. But I wonder, have you found much in your research of other areas like agriculture and farming? You mentioned someone in the mining community and as part of the gold rush. I wonder if you could speak to other occupations that Jews might have
So
belonged to.
mostly when Jews went to like a mining community, they were there to like peddle or run the store. So that was really like the overwhelming path for many of these people. You do see some other kinds of professions here and there. You don't see a lot of farming. Although there's a couple of interesting moments where in the press where people like wonder aloud, why aren't we farming more? Isaac Leeser in particular is kind of like, he basically blames peddling for the sort of religious neglect of American Jews. He says like, if only they would stop peddling, like they would all of a sudden become pious. And so that's where we see when he was talking about Monroe, I think that's part of why he likes Monroe, because it's a calm place where you can like settle down and maybe you don't have to be peddling. And actually in the very first issue of The Occident, he publishes a letter by an American Jew basically arguing, to the Mormon point, basically arguing, why don't we just get a couple 100,000 Jews and like go out west and create a state? Like they say like, let's we can get those numbers, like let's go found a Jewish state, and then we won't have to worry about like getting kosher food or observing this Saturday Sabbath, or our children marrying non-Jews. Like, let's do that. But you know, these Jews are individual and they're entrepreneurial, and they can go wherever they want, so they do. Yeah.
Hi, so I have two questions. Thank you for the talk. So one is about women. So you talked about intermarrying Christian women, but I know there's Jewish women too. So can you talk about how that changes dynamics? I assume men go first, right? But so how do women change the dynamics? And then the other question is, so a lot of the things that you talk about are kind of pragmatic, right? They're sort of in foundational sort of early moments, right? Like, we don't have this, so we're going to do this. What happens when there's a little bit more establishment? Are there other things that the process of being there kind of makes them make American Judaism different? Do you know what I mean? Like, other than just those kind of pragmatic questions, are there other elements, right, that they sort of are selecting or choosing to sort of shape Judaism differently?
Yeah, so women is a really important point. Mobility was pretty much male in this period. Like, single women were not traveling alone across the American West in the 19th century. But women did eventually kind of get westward. You know, and right, so there's a shortage of Jewish women, right, because most of these migrants are young entrepreneurial men. And in fact, one of the motivating factors for immigrants from Bavaria was that there were restrictions on Jewish marriage in Bavaria. You couldn't get married, there could only be a certain number of Jewish households in a given town, so you couldn't get married until like another household had departed. So they're young single men, and there's not a lot of Jewish women around, but some of them do marry Jewish women. Some of them actually go back to Germany to find a Jewish woman or to bring her over. And so gradually they do start coming. And you know, in these places where they create congregations, women become sort of the drivers of the congregations. And there's been really wonderful work on sort of the role of women in 19th century synagogues and how important they were. And it's interesting because they weren't allowed to be members of the congregation, but they clearly sort of made these congregations run. They were, right, that there's a reason they were being counted in a prayer form, because they were there. And in the newspapers, you see lots of sort of flowery language about like the ladies, like thank you to the ladies. And it's clear, to me, it's clear that they're like profusely thanking the ladies in part because they're not giving them any actual status within their community. It's a way to sort of alleviate, you know, the clear issue there. But so they become very involved in congregational life in different ways and become more involved. They help found in some community Sunday schools, more so along the eastern seaboard where there are sort of unmarried, like middle and upper middle class Jewish women. But you also see some Jewish women creating an economic niche as boarding house keepers. So the boarding house I showed was run by a married couple. I imagine that the woman had a lot to do with the mechanics of running that boarding house. And there's some places where you see advertisements in Jewish newspapers for, you know, Mrs. Warshower's boarding house in San Francisco or whatever. So there's some women who kind of find a place within the world of the West in sort of creating a sort of fictive Jewish household, as it were, for these kind of far-flung young men. So once communities were more established, you know, what's interesting is that even once there were congregations and rabbis, that didn't mean that Jews were willing to behave. And so there is still a lot of tensions in various ways. Like in Natchez, Mississippi, at one point, they write into their synagogue minutes like, you know, we have gone to the local Jews who have not joined and pressed upon them the importance of joining, right? Like, and they sort of like hint, like these people should be contributing to the congregation, but they're not. So that there's continuing to sort of, you know, basically feel entitled to the benefits of a congregation without becoming a member. There's also I was telling you about this earlier today, but I'll repeat it. Like in New Orleans. In the 1850s, there's a pretty sizable Jewish community. There's 3 congregations in New Orleans by the late 1850s, and they have Jewish ministers, Jewish religious leaders in town, and yet there still are lots of Jews marrying non-Jews, and a fascinating sort of controversy emerges because come to find out that these Jewish men with Christian wives are having sons, and they're circumcising the sons. even though, according to traditional Jewish law, you're only Jewish if your mother's Jewish. So these are technically not Jewish sons, and yet they're essentially paying a sort of moil, a circumciser by hire, like $5. That appears, from my research, I found that the going rate was $5 for a circumcision. So they would hire him to perform the circumcision. And there's a rabbi in town who gets very upset, who says, what are you doing? You can do that as part of a conversion ceremony, but then you need to take these sons to the ritual bath and complete the ritual bath. It's a two-part conversion ceremony. This isn't a Jewish child who could just be circumcised. And so he's very upset and he yells, and 2 of the 3 circumcisers in town close up shop, but like one guy keeps going, right? And there's still, a customer base, right? So I think, deeper even than the pragmatics is the way in which Jewish life is kind of reconfigured in this context in a voluntary way within the congregations, but also outside of the congregations. Like some of the stuff of Jewish life, you can just pay someone to do for you. You don't have to be in the congregation, and this rabbi can yell and scream as much as he wants, but like, if this guy's willing to do it, then it's fine. So then the rabbi is very upset, and he sort of lashes out and writes about it in the newspapers and claims that these sons are going to pass as Jews even though they're not Jews, and he complains sort of to high heavens. And there's also an interesting moment that I was telling you about earlier today where the rabbi claims that he's telling them, you've done the circumcision, now dunk these babies in a ritual bath and then you'll be fine. But the Christian mothers push back because they don't want a Jewish baptism for their sons. So it's a fascinating moment where to these Christian women married to Jewish men, like a circumcision is less of a big deal than a quick dunk in some water. Because to them, a quick dunk in some water is a seriously meaningful religious kind of existential transformation. Whereas like the circumcision, like maybe it seems weird, but like they don't really have any strong associations with it. So the eclecticism is something that goes deeper than just those earliest years of sort of getting things set up. And then it becomes an issue with congregations when these institutions, like the Union of American Hebrew Congregations, tries to, impose standardization, and the congregations resist it, right? So on multiple levels, you see sort of Jews wanting to go their own way and pushing back against those trying to sort of force them into a standardized orthodoxy. Yeah.
That whole exchange made me wonder about where the establishment of ritual baths came into order of operations. You said that normally the first thing was the buying of burial grounds, then the establishment of like aid societies or benevolent societies, and then congregations. Like, were there mikvahs established in these different towns? And
yeah, so Jewish ritual baths are used for conversions, but they're also used by traditional Jewish women as part of observance of the laws of marital purity. So Jewish women will immerse in the ritual bath in sort of around their menstruation, right? So there's this sort of cycle of purity and impurity, and the ritual bath is an important part of marital sexuality in traditional Jewish communities. So it's hard to get sort of concrete information about this, in part because it's a very private kind of practice. You do see examples, like I know in Memphis they create a mikveh pretty early on in the 1850s, so sometimes they'll mention it when they write into the newspapers and talk about what's going on. So you get evidence here and there. I haven't been able to get a clear sense on exactly how much. My sense is that it was not being very widely practiced. You can go to free-flowing water that can operate as a ritual bath, so some of these women might have done that. There's one fascinating source I have on this. It's a letter to Isaac Leeser, a private letter from Shreveport, Louisiana, that asks, can you use a bathtub filled with rainwater for a ritual bath? So there's at least one person, and there's probably others, looking around and trying to figure out how to approximate marital purity observance even in the absence of the infrastructure. But I think there was a lot of families who sort of, kept an idea of female purity while dissociating it from the mechanics of, dipping in the ritual bath once a month.
please join me in thanking her for a wonderful talk.
If you're a student, there's things about the minor, there's things about study abroad, and if you're not, there's also sign-up sheets if you don't get the Smithsonian Institute for Jewish Studies Minor Israel newsletter, but want to get the newsletter, or if you want to learn more about study abroad or the minor student, please look at all the material there on your way out. Go out this door, not that one.